Just a few things about my talk. Yes, there's a bibliography. I have this QR code on the last slide as well. If you're interested, I'm going to mention many sources. You might want to grab it at the end, or you can grab it now. About 55 minutes is the last timing for this talk. It's a new talk. I have given a version of this talk about 3-4 weeks ago in Virginia at the College of William and Mary, second oldest school in the United States. And so there's a little bit of Virginia's history toward the end, you'll see. But I think it's quite relevant to what's happening, frankly, what's happening in the world actually right now. Anything else before I get going here? Yeah, over the last several days, I've met many people here, and I realized that many folks are not from either the United States or Canada, so Central America, South America, Africa, Europe, Asia. And so all of a sudden I thought blacksplaining might need some splaining. So just so you know, those who may not know because English might not be your first language, mansplain entered the lexicon. It was Oxford English Dictionary Word of the Year, I think 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And it is a portmanteau, a conflation of man and explain, just so you know. And you can see it's explaining something to a woman, typically a woman in a manner that's condescending. I'm listening to a guy mansplain economics to his wife. I just grabbed that off my computer a few hours ago. And just so you know, there is, of course, whitesplain also, very similar to mansplain, white and explain. So just so you know, that's what blacksplain is. You can see there's also condescending here, but I'm going to try my best not to condescend to anyone as I blacksplain classical music. I really could have said blacksplain classical music, comma, and music education, comma, in the 21st century, because I do talk also about music education, primarily in the United States, but I think most everything I say will be applicable to Canada here. Okay, anything else? This bibliography will also live on my website under presentations if you're interested, and I always welcome emails as well if anybody wants to contact me. Okay, let me get this pulled up here. And I think we can get this party started. Who among us could ever forget this classic scene from the 1980 John Landis film, The Blues Brothers?
Okay, Cholo.
All right, man, we've been in this car for 3 hours now. Where the hell is this place?
I told you it'd take a little while to get there.
What's the name of the place?
The name of the place is, Bob's Country Bunker. Here we are.
Bob's Country Bunker?
One night I was laying down. I heard Mama and Papa talking. I heard Papa tell Mama, let that boy boogie woogie. It's in him, and he got to come out.
Jake, the sign says tonight only the good old boys.
Blues Brothers. It should read, tonight only, the Blues Brothers' triumphant return. Must be some kind of mistake. You guys unload the stuff. Elwood, come with me.
At this point in the movie, Joliet Jake Blues, played by John Belushi, searches for a gig venue for his recently reconstituted blues band, the Blues Brothers. And as they pass Bob's Country Bunker, quite by chance, he has his venue. And but there's still a dissonance with musical genres. Blues, as we just heard, on the one hand, and on the other,
what can I get you boys? You thirsty, you hungry, or you just driving through? Maybe like a beer or something a little harder? Hey, you know, we happen to make the state's best pepper steak.
No, thank you, ma'am. We may be sucking back a few beers a little later on. We'll be here all night. You see, we're the band.
You are? Oh, gee, that's nice. Hey, Bob, this is the band.
All right.
What kind of music do you usually have here?
Oh, we got both kinds. We got country and western.
Unknown to his brother Elwood, played by Dan Aykroyd, Jake claims that his blues band is the country band, the Good Old Boys, that was supposed to be playing that night. When Elwood asks the barmaid Claire, played by Sheila Wells, what kind of music they have there, she says they have both kinds, country and Western. I've always loved that line, both kinds of music, country and Western. On the one hand, those two genres are amazing and compelling and truly great American musics. Yet, on the other, they obviously represent only a small slice of what the United States has to offer musically beyond that narrow binary, country and Western. Folks, would you believe it if I told you that music education in the United States, until very recently, operated under a similarly narrow binary? Question, what kinds of music are taught here at your university? We have both kinds, tonal and post-tonal. I hardly need to point out that all of these so-called tonal and post-tonal composers were white men, as whiteness and maleness were the two requirements to be considered for candidacy in the pantheon of greatness, in the narrative of, quote, great masters of the Western canon, close quote. And you can see here typical tonal and post-tonal composers, most of whom you don't even need to know their first names because we're told we don't need to. Maybe there need to include them. Maybe there are some post-tonal composers whose first names you might not know. So on this slide, I show the textbook that we're currently using at Hunter College, written by two very dear friends of mine, Poundy Burstein and Joe Strauss. They both teach at CUNY, City University of New York, as I do. And this is the third edition of their concise introduction to tonal harmony. And this really is quite representative of how music theory has been taught in the United States up until, well, up until today, let's say, but up until 2020 when we've started to change some things fairly substantially. And I hear you've also had curriculum revisions here. I don't know a music institution that has not had these conversations over the last, say, 5 to 10 years. Nevertheless, fundamentals have been known as key signatures, scales, intervals, triads forever. That's generally what fundamentals have meant in this scenario. Harmony, voice leading, diatonic harmony, these are chords in key signatures, C major, D sharp minor, that kind of stuff. I realize that many of you have had music educations, maybe even a majority in the room, but there are some who don't have music educations. That's fine. I don't go too deep into any of these things. Chromatic harmony is here, you can see, and normally these textbooks stopped with form and analysis. Then post-tonal was an afterthought for very long, but then finally people, really only in the late 20th century, decided we really need to start looking at music that's beyond tonality, and post-tonal is generally the way we talk about this body of work. In the United States, of course, atonal music is often used, more in Europe than it is here. So I'm going to point out here that the musical examples in these types of textbooks have been and often still are nearly 100% European classical music, and they represent, in my opinion, less than 1% of the world's musics. What these textbooks generally lack are any examples from African American genres like blues, gospel, jazz, Motown, or R&B, other American genres like bluegrass, country, or metal, or notational systems, other notational systems like charts, lead sheets, Nashville numbers, or other global styles like Arabic maqams, Hindustani tihais, ragas, Indonesian gamelan, or klezmer music. On this slide, I show a breakdown of 7 music theory textbooks that I did with a former student of mine, Megan Lyons. She's now an assistant professor of music theory in South Carolina at Furman University. It appears in this textbook, this edited volume here, if you're interested in the bibliography. And we looked at 7 main textbooks for music theory in the United States. Many of these are used in Canada as well. The percentage of market share is 96%. So pretty much these are all the textbooks we use, if we use textbooks. Some people don't use textbooks. 3,039 examples total. 61 of them were written by people who were not white, for 2%. 98 of them were written by people who were not cisgender men, to 3.2%. So it's pretty stark. In other words, 98% of over 3,000 musical examples in 7 major undergraduate music theory textbooks were written by white men. And these books, as recently as 2019, account for roughly 96% of the market share. One more table from this chapter that we have in an edited volume, Teaching Difficult Topics. I just want to point out, I think it's very interesting to note just how heavily all of these authors relied on 3 and only 3 composers. You know the composers, I presume, but you can see that one textbook here, literally 1 out of 2 examples was from these 3 composers. And here in the Benward Soccer, I think this is also worth pointing out, literally 1 out of 3 examples was written by Bach, who was a very interesting composer, whose music I actually quite like, who died in 1750, so he was writing quite literally 300 years ago. It's worth pointing that out, right? And he was writing for the church, mostly. From 1717 to 1723, he worked for a nobleman in Köthen, and that's where we get his secular music. The Brandenburg concertos, the cello suites, the unaccompanied cello suites, the French suites, the English suites, the solo partitas and sonatas for violin, for example. Otherwise, those 6 years, everything was for the church, for what he wrote, right? Okay. So, just so you don't get the wrong impression that I'm just complaining. Well, okay, fine, I'm complaining, but that's where I stopped. I have co-authored a music theory undergraduate textbook with 2 brilliant younger than I am music theorists, Rosa Abrahams and Cora Palfy, over the last 4 years. This will come out in 2027. We have an editorial board just to show you that we are dipping into other types of music as well. So Adam is our local makam expert, Turkish makam in this sense. Kwame is our resident jazz expert. Amira is from North India, Hindustani music. These are all, of course, dear friends of mine. Lindsay is our resident timbre expert, and Leslie is our expert on Indonesian gamelan. Now, of course, you could have 100 or 200 or 500 people talking about different musical genres. One needs to make decisions, and it's always an open question. But what we can't do is simply keep things the way they have been. I should say, in my opinion, because there certainly are people who want to keep things the way they have been. I would just respectfully disagree. So we have 4 parts. It does kind of break down to potentially a 4-semester book, although our book could work for 2, 3, or 4 semesters. And you'll notice, oh, you want to learn keys and key signatures? Well, sure, fine. I have no problem. I know them quite well, actually. The keys and key signatures. You want to learn triads and 7th chord? How about a chapter on timbre? That's never been. There's never been a chapter on musical timbre, ever. And you think tuning systems, oh, sure, that's going to be where you teach students about equal temperament. Sure. But also, how do you tune in the system of Turkish makam or other tuning systems? Because tuning just means you're going to play in tune. We tend to put things into our, I'm going to say, I don't use the word Western much, European-trained brains, and if we hear something that doesn't fit into a 12-tone system, we call it microtonal or quarter tonal, whereas the people who actually playing just say, we're just playing in tune, man. That's what we're playing in tune, okay? And we should actually think about it from their perspective, because it's not quarter tones. It's just not. It's wrong to call it a quarter tone. Unless it is, because some music has written specifically for quarter tones. That tends to be microtonal composers like Ben Jonson from the University of Illinois. I think he might still be, he's probably not still alive. Anyway. Okay. So I'll just go quickly now through the other parts here. You can see we have musical repose is how we talk about cadence, because it's not just about perfect authentic cadences and half cadences, but there's ways you have musical repose in other types of music. We have harmonic expansions. That's pretty traditional, tonic expansions, but we also have musical syntax. And you can see we're kind of putting together different ways of conceiving an undergraduate music theory. I wrote these 3 chapters, tonicization, modulation, that's very classic, right? But how about a chapter on the blues? Because the blues is huge. That's where rock and roll was born, right? Music and dance, music embodiment, very important for us to have something about bodies moving to music, because that's extremely important. And then finally, part 4, I would just point out here that in the past, just like the last part 5 of the book that we use at Hunter, Form and analysis, this was the only thing ever taught. Sonata form, it was all going to sonata form. Small binary, small ternary, theme and variations, fugue and invention maybe, but it was all a way to say ultimately we're moving to sonata form as if it were some kind of end goal in a teleological fashion, going to the peak of musical humanity, when in fact it was just a form written by people on planet Earth that sometimes resulted in beautiful sonatas, and sometimes they resulted in really ugly, bad sonatas. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Music, gender, sexuality, jazz, ethnomusicology, religious music, how about that? Corpus studies, music, social justice, video game music, musicology, film, mashups, all very important stuff. Okay. Let's see. Finally, a quick breakdown of post-tonal textbooks. It's a little less well-defined than tonal harmony because this was always thought of as not as important as Brahms and Beethoven and Mozart, right? Nevertheless, technically I'm a 20th century guy. That's my specialty, pitch class set analysis, neo-Riemannian theory, stuff like that, if that rings, if any of you know of some of these things. I have used these 3 books in my own classes. I've never used the one by Kent Williams. And this is a little bit older. You can see the latest one is Joe Strauss. Yes, the same Joe Strauss. I didn't have time to flip through and count examples for this. I just looked to the indices to find the composers, whom I know all the names. And you can see that they're basically all white composers. Okay, there were Toru Takemitsu from Japan. George Walker's African American. Aside from these 2 examples, it was all white people. So that's pretty much 0%. And the women fared a little bit better, right? And I give Joe credit for quite consciously trying to find women composers. Of course, the first thing you'll hear when somebody might comment on this, just want to make sure I'm not missing anything here. When somebody might comment on this who wants to maintain the status quo, of course, the first thing you hear is, oh, we would have loved to have had more composers, but there were none, right? It's a very common thing to say. I would plead with all of you to never accept that because it's pretty much never true. It's just never true. So, I mean, it's very easy for me to find people who wrote pencil on paper music, 5-line staves, who were not white men, white women, or women who were people of color also. I mean, I could do this all day, right? It's quite easy to find people. So I would just respectfully suggest to you that when somebody says that, you're looking at a person probably who lacks the courage to actually understand what's going on. We would have loved to have had. Sure, it sounds great when people say that, but let's be honest, okay? That person probably would not loved to have had more women in the room, more black people in the room, more disabled people or I don't know, LGBTQ folks in the room, if we're being honest, right? I don't want to, my blood's starting to boil a little bit, sorry. Okay, so you might think that 20th century music theory textbooks might include examples from jazz. Obviously, there are none. There are 0 jazz examples in those 20th century textbooks. So here is a non-exhaustive list of jazz artists who could have easily been included in such textbooks. People often say, oh, it's improvisatory, it can't be included. Well, in point of fact, half of these people wrote music down, 5-line staff, pencil on paper. George Russell wrote a book, The Lydian Chromatic Concept. It's a brilliant, thick book about tonality that gets taught in jazz, but it really should be taught in music theory classes. Henry Threadgill, Wadad Ali Smith, Yusuf Lateef, David Baker, Anthony Braxton, my goodness, he wrote a lot of music, pencil on paper. And they would be fine to be called jazz artists. Well, the reason that there are no jazz examples in these 20th century American music theory textbooks is simple. It is because of racial segregationism. I will come back to racial segregationism because it is the reason, in fact, why all of our textbooks, up until as recently as 5 years ago, essentially had nearly 100% white composers. Because of racial segregation. It's extremely important, right? Many other things flow from that simple fact. The exclusion of women, of course, is the next big one, and that's something I talk about often, because that's very easy to prove. You just look at the books, and there they are, and there are no women, and okay, let's talk numbers. I'm a numbers guy. Okay, in our American history of, when I say American, of course, I'm saying primarily the United States of America, but many of these things are operative here, obviously, as well. In our American history of music education, a great emphasis was placed on the tonal repertoire until the late 20th century, when certain educators realized that we should teach music that was composed after 1897, which is when Johannes Brahms died. But we needed a narrative, or as I like to say, a mythology, to explain why we needed to teach 20th century music. This post-tonal mythology began with Arnold Schoenberg. Here is my former advisor from Yale University, Alan Fort's narration of that story, that mythology, from his 1973, The Structure of Atonal Music. Alan wrote, in 1908, a profound change in music was initiated when Arnold Schoenberg began composing his George-Lieder. I remember, that's just German, right? One student in one of Alan Fort's classes once said, yeah, the George Lieder, and Alan's like, whoa, 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 George-Lieder, and I'm like, okay, I won't make that mistake. Linus, how am I doing? Yeah? All right, I'll take it. The George-Lieder, Opus 15. In this work, he deliberately relinquished the traditional system of tonality, which had been the basis of musical syntax for the previous 250 years. Subsequently, Schoenberg, Anton Webert, Alban Berg, and a number of other composers created the large repertoire known as atonal music. Here we see the beginning, the painting of the picture of Western greatness, right? This mythology of the creation of atonal music accomplishes two goals. It creates a hagiography around one composer, Arnold Schoenberg, above all others, while simultaneously creating a starting point for the chapter in the book of Western musical greatness on a so-called atonal music. What this mythology omits is the long list of composers who concurrently wrote such music, composers such as Joseph Hauer, Nikolai Roslevitz, Alexander Scriabin, or the American Charles Ives, who, before Schoenberg's 1908 George-Lieder, wrote the song The Cage in 1906. A piece that uses whole tone scales and clusters and is most certainly not tonal. This mythology of the 1908 break between tonal and post-tonal music also omits other significant turn-of-the-century tonal composers. Tonal composers like Sergei Taneyev, Nikolai Metner, Johann Svensson, Johann Halvorsen, Mel Boni, and Montague Ring. Here's the beginning of Mel Boni's F major cello sonata from 1904. And here is Montague Ring's Beneath the Crescent Moon from 1924. I wonder why Mel Beny and Montague Ring are not considered canonic composers. Maybe one of you can help me understand why. I also wonder why they went by Mel and Montague Ring. I think we probably know the answer to that question. Side note, the father of Amanda Aldridge was Ira Aldridge. Her mother was a Swede. She was from Sweden. Ira Aldridge was a free black born in 1807 in New York City who showed great talent for acting and wanted to become an actor, and people were like, yeah, you can't do that here. So he moved to England and he became one of the most famous Shakespearean actors in London in the 19th century. A fascinating figure, Ira Aldridge. Do you know who is considered canonic? Anton Bruckner, whom I call the poor man's Gustav Mahler. Anton Bruckner, a man who wrote one crappy symphony 9 times. Now, I hasten to add that this is just my opinion, obviously. Furthermore, if somebody wants to study Bruckner, play his symphonies, conduct his symphonies, write a book on Bruckner, knock yourself out. You have a place in my tent. I simply want to point out that for too long, people who teach music like this, which is, in my opinion, crappy music, they tell us that, oh, if you can't understand Bruckner's genius, well, that's on you. You clearly don't have the brain, don't have the ears, you're not a good enough musician. Maybe one day you will be. Well, guess what? I have the brains, I have the musicianship, and I'm here to tell you with lots of bona fides that he was a crappy composer. Have a nice night, right? So you understand what I'm saying, right? It's the mediocrity we are forced to deal with, and then Amanda Aldridge never has a day in court at all, ever, right? Okay, I promised you that I would get back to a history of racial segregationism, and this is a slide. When I ran this afternoon, I get stuck on this because there's lots of history here, and there are citations from my bibliography if you're interested. I'll try to speed it up a little bit. So, white supremacy, the historian Ibram Kendi puts the beginning in the 1450s with 2 papal edicts called bulls by Nicholas V to Afonso V in Portugal, with giving him license to go around the globe and to start to, of course, proselytize Christianity, but also to enslave people in perpetuity, as was written in the papal bull. This is 1452 and 1456, if I'm not mistaken. So that's where he says the beginning of white supremacy happened. Of course, colonization as well. The creation of race, according to Rebecca Ann Gertz, a historian at New York University. This book was her Harvard PhD, by the way. It's called The Baptism of Early Virginia, How Christianity Created Race. I highly recommend that book by Rebecca Ann Gertz. She writes, quote, "At the beginning of the 17th century, English people did not think of themselves as white. With their words and deeds, Anglo-Virginians gradually created a world where whiteness and Christianity were bound to freedom, political power, and the potential for wealth." She also came up with this concept of hereditary heathenism, with the main goal of having indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans unable to become Christian, that it was their heathenism was passed down from fathers or mothers and fathers to their children. A great book if you're interested. The hierarchies of race were, of course, European. They were cooked up in Europe, right? We have many faults in the United States, but cooking up white supremacy is not one of them. We just happen to promote it more than any other people once it was there. Carl Linnaeus was a Swede. My mother was from Norway, so I feel quite justified in speaking badly of the Swede. Norway just got their independence from Sweden in 1905. I don't know if you know that, and they've been battling. You know, they're border countries, right? So anyway. He grouped people into 4 categories, Blumenbach into 5, and more than any other author, Carl Linnaeus is the reason why we say the word black for people from Africa, because writing in Latin, they both wrote in Latin, but the four for Linnaeus were European white, American red, Asian yellow, and African black. In Latin, but the word black really was solid. People had used the word black before, but this is where we really get black from, Linnaeus. And Blumenbach is the person who gave us the word Caucasian. In the completely mythical, strange belief, not true, that white people, the most beautiful people, came from the Caucasus, namely Georgia. It's strange that even to this day, you'll find people who use the word Caucasian for white. It's more or less going away. He had 5 group: American, Caucasian, Ethiopian was black. That's another word for African, right? Malayan and Mongolian, those were those 5 there. Another little side note here, I lived in Russia for 7 years of my life. I married a Russian in Moscow in 2002. The people, Litsa Kavkazskих национальностей, the Caucasian peoples, are called in Russian черные люди, black people. Because their skin color generally is darker than Slavic Russians. So it's kind of ironic that Caucasians are black in Russia and Caucasians are white here, when in fact they're basically neither. I just call them people from the Caucasus region. I mean, call me crazy. Blumenbach, he was German. A few court cases here that were very important in how we think of race and racial segregationism. The first would be Dred Scott. This was a 7-2 ruling, and Chief Justice Roger Tanning wrote that, quote, Africans had for more than a century been regarded as beings of an inferior order, and so far inferior that they had no rights to which the white man was bound. They had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. That was in the Dred Scott case. If you're interested, we can do it in the Q&A, but Dred Scott was a black man. He sued for his freedom. He lost. He was manumitted, and he died in 1858, Dred Scott. But interestingly here, and I think this is an important little tangent, there were 2 dissenters, Benjamin Curtis and John McLean, and they wrote in their dissent, quote, that the free native-born citizens of each state are citizens of the United States, and that as free colored persons born within some of the states are citizens of those states, such persons are also citizens of the United States. And then they dissented, I dissent therefore from that part of the opinion of the majority in which it is held that a person of African descent cannot be a citizen of the United States. They thought that they had solved this issue with the Dred Scott ruling. They solved it in the other direction. The Civil War started 4 years later, I'm sure you all know. It really was kind of an opening salvo of the Civil War. And the point that I'd like to make here is our Reconstruction amendments, that's the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Republican Congressman from Ohio, John Bingham, who happens to be one of my heroes, who authored the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which is the high water mark, in my opinion, of our otherwise very questionable Constitution. John Bingham wrote, quote, all persons born, this was in 1868, 11 years later. All persons born or naturalized in the United States are subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. Same language from the dissent. So the point to make here is birthright citizenship, which is in the 14th Amendment, is under, Donald Trump signed an executive order saying he's getting rid of it. He can't, that's not the way it works. And I think even our very strange Supreme Court will not allow that. But people really misunderstand birthright citizenship. It has 0 to do with people coming to the states to give birth. It has 100% to do allowing black people born in the country to be citizens because of Dred Scott. It's a big difference. Now, if we had a functioning government in the United States, we'd come together to write rules, because I know of rich Russians who fly in, give birth, and fly out. Then that's a problem. It's a problem for both Russia and the United States, I should say, because they know that even today an American passport is better than a Russian passport. Don't tell the Russians I said that. Okay, but birthright citizenship. Canada's a birthright citizenship country. There are about 30 such countries on the planet. And it's an important historical point, actually, where and how and why we get that. Okay, like I said, I get mired in the mud on this slide. I'll try to get going here again. So after the Reconstruction Amendments and the 15th Amendment gave black men, not women, the right to vote. Women was 1920 with the 19th Amendment. They needed something to get rid of the equality of Reconstruction, the 12-year period after the Civil War. Separate but equal was enshrined in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, and this was the beginning of segregation and Jim Crow racism. The entrance for white people, the entrance for colored people. You've seen those signs, a drinking fountain for white people, a drinking fountain. That's because of it made constitutional separating the races, segregating the races. And that is extremely important in this history. There was one dissenter. His name was John Marshall Harlan. The person writing for the majority was Associate Justice Henry Billings Brown. John Marshall Harlan was from Kentucky. Henry Billings Brown was from Massachusetts. And now I will cite Donald Yacovone's Teaching White Supremacy, a brilliant book from 2020, I think. Donald Yacovone, who is a white man himself. Donald Yacovone writes about this ruling, quote, Massachusetts, usually thought of as the cradle of abolition and liberalism, was the birthplace of Jim Crow and white supremacy. And then he writes, it's richly ironic that the judge who would institutionalize white supremacy and black inferiority in law came from Massachusetts, while the lone dissenter in the Plessy case, Judge John Marshall Harlan, had been a Kentucky slave owner. In a very direct way, the Plessy case reunited North and South on the principle of white supremacy. And this is also a very important point because I don't know how well you might know the United States, but it's very common for people in the North to look at the South askance and to blame them. Oh, you have such awful racism in the South. Oh, we feel so sorry for you. To which you should say, well, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, I'm pretty sure. That's not in the South, is it? It's so much easier to cast blame somewhere else. And let me make the point here in Canada. Is it not much easier to cast blame at the United States now? There's a lot of blame, let's be honest. The US is really unraveling. I don't think that's even controversial to say. And yet, of course Canada is rooted in white supremacy and patriarchy. As I said to a class yesterday, I think, how many non-white prime ministers has Canada had? I know, that's that many. Which makes the United States one better than Canada on that count. In other words, sure, fine, blame the United States, laugh at the United States, that's fine, I do that. But also, look in the mirror as Canadians, and I'm a Canadian citizen as well. I feel I can say this. There is plenty to work on right here in Canada with respect to all the things I'm talking about. So again, courage is what we need more of in these cases. Okay, now I think I can go a little bit quicker. The end of this madness came with another Supreme Court ruling. Maybe you know Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. This was a unanimous 9-0 ruling, and that's when, it went on for a few decades, these battles, lots of blood, lots of horrors. Right after this ruling was created what were called citizens' councils across the whole country, and their entire goal was to turn back this ruling. They were like a Ku Klux Klan without all the violence, right? The citizens' councils. And they have here from New Orleans, I'll show you a flyer that they distributed. This was a flyer from the Citizens Council of New Orleans. Notice, stop, help save the youth of America. Don't buy Negro records. If you don't want to serve Negroes in your place of business, then do not have Negro records on your jukebox or listen to Negro records on the radio. The screaming, idiotic words and savage music of these records are undermining the morals of our white youth in America. Call the advertisers of the radio stations that play this type of music and complain to them. Don't let your children buy or listen to these Negro records. Citizens Council of Greater New Orleans. There's no year. I can give you a year because there were no such things as citizens' councils. Before Brown v. Board of Education, they didn't exist. So it was somewhere between the ruling, 1954, and probably 1960, I would say. I don't know when the last Citizens Council closed up shop, but such shops really never close up, do they? They just change the name. So we have plenty of white supremacist organizations in the United States. You do too here in Canada. Okay, finally, the election of Obama, not 2008. George Bush had completely driven the bus into the ditch. The Great Recession, we were losing 700,000 or 800,000 jobs a month. Mickey Mouse could have beaten John McCain in 2008. I could have beaten John McCain in 2008. It didn't matter. What Obama did that was unique was getting through the Democratic primary, especially against Hillary Clinton. That was something to behold. Beating John McCain, that was easy. But it was the re-election of Barack Obama in 2012 that really short-circuited something in the patriarchal white supremacist brain, historical brain of the United States. And that's when something had to be done. What was done? The John Roberts Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in Shelby v. Holder, 2013. And immediately, about 25 states began to make it much harder for people to vote. The United States has been, it's a pendulum swinging between democracy and voting rights, anti-democracy, anti-voting rights. And we're very much in another cycle of anti-voting. The less voting, the better for people in power today, right? And I guess I would just end by saying, if John Roberts' court had not gutted this was a 5-4 decision, if they had not gutted the VRA in 2013, we might all be living in a very, very different world today, right? There it is. Okay, the last, say, quarter of my talk today has to do with, hold on a sec here, with these two early Virginia precedents that I talked about. Again, to understand racial segregationism, this is extremely important. I love studying these historical documents and cases. I think I was a lawyer in another life. But the case of John Punch is extremely important. So there are two cases, and then I'll conclude. So the case of John Punch. In 1640, the black indentured servant John Punch ran away with two white such servants, a Dutchman named Victor and a Scot named James Gregory, from their owner, the English Virginia planter Hugh Gwynn. After their capture and return, the General Court in Virginia's colonial government ruled on July 9, 1640, that Victor and James Gregory shall first serve out their times with their master according to their indentures, and 1 whole year apiece after the time of their service is expired. Whereas John Punch, who was named as a Negro in the ruling, quote, shall serve his said master or his assigns for the time of his natural life here or elsewhere. They also ruled that the 3 servants shall receive the punishment of whipping and have 30 stripes apiece. Several important points stand out here. The first being the simple fact that of the 3 indentured servants, only John Punch received a sentence of lifelong bondage. For this reason, Punch is often referred to as the first official slave in America based on the documentary evidence of the trial. Notably, enslaved Africans had only been in America for 21 years at this point, since 1619. It's also worth pointing out that the corporal punishment of whipping and 30 stripes apiece was meted out equally, which implied that the 3 men were equivalent in at least that one respect, and that there was, facially, no reason to believe. I really should have been a lawyer, right? I got to get rid of facially. That's pure legalese. There was no reason to believe that Punch was somehow more guilty of the alleged crime than Victor or James Gregory. Finally, note the absence of the word white to describe the Dutchman and the Scot, or the Scotchman in the ruling. Notably, such people were not yet called white in the Americas. The first usage of the word white for people in colonial America came in 1691. And there were 2 houses in Virginia. I mean, if you study the history of the United States, you're going to study the history of Virginia. That's basically the colonial history. All the presidents, most of them were slave owners. Like 11 of the first 13 presidents were slave owners. Most of them came from Virginia, so just a little FYI. There were two houses, the Council of Governors, the higher house, the lower house is the House of Burgesses, all in subordination to the English crown, obviously. And you can see that this was part of an act to stop runaway slaves. That's what this was trying to do. But within that is contained the first instances of the word white for white people. And it was to prevent people like me, for example, that abomination of races, the mixture of races. My mother was white, my father was black. And in order to prevent this, we have to prevent Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians intermarrying with English. They really wanted this to apply to English women. That's what it was. It was about English. But they're like, English or other white women, right? It's actually written very poorly. But who was white in 1691? Almost no one. Not a single Catholic person was white in Virginia in 1691. Were Nordic people like my mother white? Probably, yeah, probably. Were Slavic people like my wife white? Absolutely not. Where does the word slave come from, after all? I hope you all know that. Slave comes from Slav, because Slavs were taken as slaves in Europe. No Catholics whatsoever were white. Here I should cite, not on my bibliography, Nell Irving Painter's The History of White People from 2010. She's a retired black historian from Princeton. Best book out there if you want to read about the history of white people. Although I don't think she has the 1691 in that book. It's been years since I've read it. So you can see how they really are talking about English women, but they're like, okay, other white women. Oh yeah, let's throw in man there as well, I guess. Why not? I guess we should stop white men from marrying non-white women. So they're like, yeah, sure, we'll put in man or woman. But it was really about stopping English women from marrying outside of essentially white men. And you might as well just say English men at that point, right? Okay. Anything else about that? And I am done with John Punch, and now I have just Elizabeth Key Grinstead. Very interesting case here of Elizabeth Key Grinstead. Another significant 17th century court case that clarified colonial America's segregationism was that of Elizabeth Key Grinstead, the daughter of an enslaved Angolan woman and an Englishman, Thomas Key, who acknowledged his parentage of Elizabeth, had her baptized in the American Anglican Church, and before his death in 1636, placed her in indentured servitude with fellow Englishman Humphrey Higginson until she turned 15. At that point, she was supposed to be set free, but that didn't happen. She remained in bondage. In 1656, the same general court of the Virginia colonial government that decided the case of John Punch, Key Grinstead sued for her freedom and won, based on her parental lineage and her Christianity. As black law professor Tanya Lovell Banks put it in an article from 2008, based on these two statuses, English, parental ancestry, and Christian religion, Elizabeth asserted that she must be treated as an English indentured servant whose term of service had expired. Key Grinstead's freedom followed the patriarchal tradition of partus sequitur partum, or that which is born follows the father, patriarchy. It took the Virginia House of Burgesses only 6 years to fix this rule so that a case like Key Grinstead's would not succeed in court again. In 1662, the House of Burgesses replaced partus sequitur partum with the doctrine partus sequitur ventrum, or that which is born follows the womb or the mother, which accomplished two things. First, it ensured that the mixed children of Englishmen and black enslaved women could not and would not ever be considered free. And second, and more important, it incentivized the raping of these women by white enslavers in order to produce more enslaved people. Thomas Jefferson himself realized the value in partus sequitur ventrum when he wrote in a letter to John Eppes on June 30th, 1820, "I know no error more consuming to an estate than that of stocking farms with," he did not write enslaved, of course, this is my square brackets, with enslaved men almost exclusively. I consider an enslaved woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man of the farm. What she produces is an addition to capital, while his labors disappear in mere consumption. Imagine my surprise in learning an hour before I gave this talk at William and Mary in Virginia that Thomas Jefferson was an alumnus of William and Mary, literally. Okay. Oopsies. They took it very well. It was fine. Hey, don't shoot the messenger. I didn't write this, right? This is the third president of the United States. I'm sure he's on some money if you're interested, if you want to check. But yeah, so there it was. Thomas Jefferson clearly understood the partus sequitur ventrum doctrine and the simple fact that enslaved black females could create new enslaved workers while never having to visit the African continent. And Jefferson's own monstrous side is well documented in the children he fathered with his enslaved woman Sally Hemings, and in all likelihood others as well. Yet in our tendency to whitewash significant white men in U.S. history, discussing Jefferson's monstrous side remains controversial and, in certain circles, utterly taboo. Nevertheless, two things are true about Thomas Jefferson. He was, on the one hand, an extremely significant figure in the United States founding. I didn't edit that out. Still thinking about Virginia. In the founding of the United States, who wrote some of the most important documents known to humankind, while, on the other hand, he clearly forced himself sexually on his own enslaved girls and women in order to impregnate them to produce more slaves, which was, in his own words, more profitable and an addition to the capital of any plantation. Our contemporary inability to understand this complicated dueling nature of founding figures like Thomas Jefferson has proven to be one of the most durable and intractable problems in our efforts to make racial progress in the United States. In the United States, we are taught hero worship above all else when dealing with figures like Jefferson, all the while sweeping the inconvenient and contradictory histories under the rug. Returning to music, by way of conclusion here, we musicians too have been taught and continue to teach hero worship regarding our so-called canonic composers as well. And when a person has the good sense to point out that this musical hero worship is highly problematic at best and downright harmful at worst, that person is dragged through the mud, denigrated, and made out to be a monster themselves. Ask me how I know. Folks, the hardest part is letting go. Letting go of the false notions that we have been taught historically in the United States about music. The false notion that men, because of their maleness, make better orchestral conductors than women. The false notion that white persons, because of their whiteness, compose better and more complex music than non-white persons. The false notion that C.P.E. Bach's music is better than Francisca Lebrun's, Robert Schumann's better than Edmond Dedet's, Bela Bartok's music better than Ethel Smith's, Igor Stravinsky's better than Julia Perry's, or Georgi Ligody's music better than Unsuk Chin's. Or the false notion that Johannes Brahms' Third Symphony represents a higher level of musical sophistication than Sufjan Stevens's Illinois. The reason I know this to be false is simple, because no one can prove definitively that any one body of music is better or more significant than another. Anyone who claims they can is gaslighting you. Ultimately, all notions of good and bad, of musical sophistication and complexity that we have been taught in our schools and conservatories of music are opinion and not fact. We should never lose sight of this simple point in our work. In closing, let me highlight the great things now happening in music education across the United States and here as well in Canada. Junior scholars especially are working overtime to enrich our music educational institutions, and I couldn't be happier to see these changes happening, changes that were frankly unthinkable even 10 years ago. Music education is changing for the better and changing rapidly. And seeing younger generations, of course, I got my first senior discount today. That's really ringing true right now. And seeing younger generations meaningfully engage with various musics from all over the planet warms my heart and will surely result in making classical music and music education more welcoming for everyone, which is a goal I'm pretty sure we all share. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you, Dr. Ewell, for the talk. Kind of a, I suppose, personal question, right? Being from Germany, having done my undergraduate degree in a historical musicology major and recognizing the problems that you so aptly put. And I know you wrote about this on your blog before, but maybe provide the quote-unquote, as you just put it, newer generation, maybe with some, what can we do, what do you think all the people here can add to that, right? We joked about in Germany that we'll just let them die out, the old white men, but because that history is still actively being taught, there's still even people in the newer generation actively clinging to said history, right? And I think some of the things you've mentioned on your blog would be just nice for everyone here to hear, because I think they're important thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. Waiting for the older generations to die out, I'll answer that first, is not a good idea in the sense that in music it's not so common to find younger generations who are just absolutely in support of keeping everything the way it was and studying figured bass and counterpoint and part writing and Mozart, Beethoven, and Bach. Younger generations, it's pretty rare. But it's certainly there. You'll find younger generations of musicians who believe, especially in conservatories, especially pianists, for example, or violinists. Those are usually the two main instruments that still want to cling to the past. But if you look beyond music, if you look at in politics in the United States right now, you'll notice that Charlie Kirk was assassinated, but he was only 31 years old, and he led this Turning Point USA, if you know, but it's an extremely conservative organization for young people, which is extremely popular in the United States. So just to comment on the generational aspect, I often do say that
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Sorry. Wow. That's hilarious. To have it's a mistake to think that there are no supporters of the status quo, as I often say, among young folks in music, because there just really are a lot. So it really is, I would probably cite here again Ibram Kendi. He talks about a struggle. It's a struggle, and he puts it bluntly, as between racism and anti-racism. And that's a good way to put it, although it's a little bit too crude sometimes. It doesn't always work like that. But to answer the first part of your question, the first thing I usually say for students, graduate students, undergraduate students, is you have to be careful, because there are people who are extremely invested, and they often get very upset, and they can act very irrationally. And they can harm students, because students don't have that much power. But you do have more power if you band together and you get together with like-minded students and you form groups. There's safety in numbers. I've seen amazing things happen among student groups. Getting together with allies, drafting documents, sending them up the chain very respectfully and collegially. Then the administrators, there might be faculty dissenters, but administrators will listen, because I don't like neoliberalism that much. But one thing that's good about it is that administrators are accountable to students, and they respond. If 20 people sign this thing, we want to see some changes. I've seen it happen many times. That's really the best advice I could give to students. Otherwise, it's very difficult, because the people who can be very angry, who want to support the status quo, I think in many ways they understand that it doesn't make a lot of sense. There are not jobs for people who want to teach figured bass and play Mozart all the time. It's fine, do it, play that. But if that's the only thing, then you just will not ever have a job in music. And that's just a dereliction of duty as a music educator to maintain the facade, or to maintain the fallacy that that's still possible, because it's not. Thank you for that question.
Thank you so much.
As we know, in North America in general, there is like a mass defunding of the arts these days. Like in my own province itself, there has been seen about maybe 100% of grant fundings defunded in Nova Scotia. So we always talk about how are we going to get the youth interested into going against the Western canon, but most of the investors for our organizations are from the baby boomer generation, and they're the biggest demographic as well. So I'm trying to think about like how we would be able to give interest to that demographic towards music that veers away from the Western canon. Is that possible?
It is possible. I don't want to say it's impossible, but that's a very tricky one. Similarly to the answer I just gave, to an extent, one would need to find allies. But if you're finding allies among your age group, that's one thing. That's what we were talking about there. Then you would need to find some allies among some of the senior scholars. Now, I'm a senior scholar, and I could easily be an ally to people where I teach, and I have been, because I shouldn't be so harsh on the senior scholar generation, let's say 60 and over. There are many people who want to see changes and who understand it and who agree with me completely. It's not at all uncommon. So you can find people in positions of power. Furthermore, if you go outside of the music academy, you can continue to find people with power who agree with these things. Here, it's way more often to talk about decolonization. It's a little less common in the United States. I mean, in one very basic sense, we decolonized when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. That was 1776. Literally, we stopped being a colony in 1776. Doesn't mean we gave up on colonizing stuff, but it just has a different meaning, that word, in the United States. There are lots of people who are people with power, people with money, funders, It's a kind of a daunting task to think about, to have a student or a student group reach out to some, people who are, giving money to an institution. But you never know. There might be people who are very in line with what you're thinking about in terms of if it's decolonizing or decentering some of the Western aspects of music education. And you might be surprised to find out how many people can do that. But I think that's the best I can do. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Hello.
Hi.
So I'm a music student, and I find that in our classrooms we're still being taught about a musical canon, and I guess like there's, I think, flaws in the way that we teach about the musical canon now, where the way we talk about it is still acknowledging the canon, but acknowledging its flaws as well. And I'm wondering if, in your opinion, do you think that the inherent nature of considering historical Western classical art music as a canon of something that we should be acknowledging as like, I guess like a cultural standard of classical music is flawed? And if you do think it's flawed in the idea of a canon, how can we move away from that method of teaching where we still consider these composers as like undeniably great, but we can kind of, I guess, now we're kind of beginning to look at these composers and criticize them, but still acknowledging their like greatness. I use quotes.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is how can we kind of move away from this idea of a canon into kind of, I guess, what your textbook was kind of mentioning?
Yeah. So the idea of canon and canonization is part and parcel, of course, of a very hierarchical way of viewing the world. The first thing I would probably point out is that the idea of a canon comes from the Catholic Church. To be canonized is to be, canonize a saint or something, right? For that matter, a 5-line staff comes from the Catholic Church. I sometimes simply call that Christian notation, because it is 5-line staff notation, right? It started with 4 lines, 5. There was as much as 6 lines, actually, but 5 is more or less the standard these days. But it's Christian. It's the Catholic Church. And once one realizes the indebtedness that this style or this way of thinking about a musical canon has to Christianity and the Catholic Church, I think it makes it an easier argument to say, This is not something that we should be forcing on everybody. It's unacceptable. The very notion of canon is unacceptable, in my mind. Because it very clearly has those links to the Catholic Church and to Christianity, and there are just a lot of people. I'm not a Christian personally. My mother was, and she was like one of the coolest people on the planet. Okay, great. Believe what you want, do anything you want, that's fine. But once one makes requirements, then it becomes problematic. And the idea of that vertical power structure that is so deeply embedded in canonization, whether it's in the Catholic Church or canonizing rock and roll by saying that the Beatles started everything, when Paul McCartney himself said, no, it was black people in the States, they started it. He doesn't have a problem acknowledging that. You know who does? White male music theorists who work on the Beatles. I know that, and I know them. And I'm not saying that they're awful people. Mark Spice is a good friend of mine. In fact, I think he would agree with what I'm saying, that the canonization of anybody is wrong because it's essentially a deification. I use the word hagiography in my talk. It's lionizing somebody. I literally had last week, I'm teaching Music Theory 2, one of my classes, and maybe I had a Beethoven example from Poundy and Joe's textbook. On the screen, we were talking about something. And one of my undergrad students, brilliant student, Katya, she's like, in high school they said that Beethoven, he like represents Abraham from the Abrahamic religions. And I'm like, wow, okay. That really is deification right there, And we had a nice, interesting conversation for 5 minutes about it. And then I sent them a link to my blog post, which is entitled, Beethoven was an above-average composer, let's leave it at that. Which is a true statement. Boy, if I could tell you how much I heard from so many haters after that. It was quite interesting, actually. I don't mind, because, that blog post, which I just said, I got to get some of this stuff out of my mind. This is ridiculous. It showed up in The New Yorker. It showed up in The Economist. It showed up in Die Zeit. It showed up all over the planet. And it might have 1 million reads. I don't even check analytics for a while. I don't really care. But I'm diametrically opposed to this person's high school music history teacher who literally was comparing Beethoven to Abraham. Okay? But that was like 1 or 2 years ago, because this Katya is probably 19 years old. I think she's a freshman. So that's what we're up against. It's a great question, really, because the canon, there was this music theory panel that I was on in Florida a couple of years ago. And if there is one thing positive to say about canon, let me argue with myself. It is the idea that there is some type of standardization that makes communication among a group of peoples easier. Okay, fair. It's very similar to having a language like English in the United States, which is a default official language. We don't have an official language at all. And saying, oh yeah, knowing English, it helps you get on in the United States. I'm not going to argue with that. It'll help you manage stuff in the United States. Fine. But there are certain hegemonic, that's the term I like to use usually, hegemonic aspects that are very unseemly about requiring and forcing people to do things against their will. And that's what we see in the United States a lot of these days. And I could easily make an argument that having that one way of understanding music be the be-all and end-all is problematic for exactly the same reasons, especially in music where there's just so much rich stuff going on out there. And at the same time, let's be honest, almost nobody is listening to classical music, which I love very much. Like I said in a class yesterday, every time I get to play one of Brahms's 4 symphonies, well, that's a great day, great night, I should say. You don't pay them in the daytime. Well, you can verse them in the daytime. I love those 4 symphonies. Played them all, they're great. I've played most of the big repertoire out there. Actually, honestly, I don't think I've played a Bruckner symphony. It's hard to even know. I played a couple of professional orchestras in Russia. I played a ton of music as a section cellist back there, dutifully playing. If I had been principal cello, I would have remembered. because you actually really need to stay awake and, you know, pass along bowings to the section. They're looking up to you, and I've played a lot of principal cello in my life. Thank you for the question. It's a good one.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Please.
So, like, in an ideal world, if you could pick, would you prefer an approach that, or not even an approach, would you prefer, like, in your opinion, a very heavily modified and constantly evolving canon, or just scrap entirely the idea of a musical canon and kind of recognize music as something that is constantly growing and doesn't really have any need for like a gold standard, I guess?
In my, yeah, a good follow-up. I think that I would prefer not using the word canon at all ever again. But it doesn't mean that I wouldn't have a body of music that I might be coming back to fairly often. In the 4 parts of our undergraduate textbook, there's plenty of 5-line stuff. You're going to get all of that, right? Because, well, I shouldn't say you're going to get all of it. You're going to get very minimal part writing, SATB part writing. You're going to get figured bass is kind of an appendix in the back, right? If you don't know figured bass, it's a very antiquated way of understanding harmony. It just doesn't have any practical use at all. And yet it's still taught in AP music theory, for example, in high school. So there's plenty that we have gotten rid of in our music theory textbook. But, you know, key signatures, 5-line staff, chords moving, you know, dominants and tonics and stuff like that, which will allow you to put forth lots of music. Yes, we have a couple of Beethoven examples in our book, but we don't have 100. Yes, we have maybe 3 or 4 Bach examples. I used a couple of them, but we don't have 200. I mean, why would you just keep going back to Bach to show how he did stuff 300 years ago that really doesn't have a lot of relevance today? People will, no, it's still very relevant. No, it's not. It's just not. And it's interesting, I actually like Bach's music myself, that's my opinion. I don't like Mozart. Okay, I have opinions, and there they are. But you know, knowing some of the quote-unquote Western notation and music, again, not canon, composers, allows me to put up all these fascinating composers like Amanda Aldridge or Louise Ferenc, for instance. I commented on her, I think, yesterday, who was the first full-time woman faculty at the Paris Conservatoire, a virtuoso pianist, and a great badass composer who died in 1875 at the age of 74. She was born in 1801. And she wrote 3 symphonies, and I've never gotten a chance to play them. I've never heard one live, and I've never played one, which is a crime, because we were forced to play or listen to Bruckner or other bad composers, or we were listening to good symphonists like Johannes Brahms. Okay, fine, but do you really need to do it for a 50th time? And you've never once played one of Louise Ferenc's 3 symphonies? Just saying. Thank you.
Hi. We're a bit of interlopers this evening. We were here because we dance upstairs.
Okay.
And it's because MMAP has provided us with that dance studio upstairs.
Oh, great.
But that just leads me into dance is found in under music and theater. We don't have our own. We're new to the academy, yet we share the very same history. That when you laid out that history, we share the same history.
Absolutely.
But because we are so new to the academy and we talk about bodies and what travels on the body, what is, you know, on the body mark, it just opens the door to all of these conversations, you know? And scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw, who gives us a term like intersectionality, really rich, you know, possibility. And so I just want to ask, like when we have dancers like Lil Buck, who's dancing with Yo-Yo Ma, doing a ballet, it really kind of opens the door to cross-discipline talking dialogue.
Yeah, collaboration.
With music and dance and bodies. And I just wonder, are you involved in any of that? Like, because I see the Ta-Nehisi Coates, you know, that's like an embodied somatic process in that book.
Oh, yeah.
And it's very rich. So I'm back to your history of music, which is also a history of dance. I see that you have embodied music in there or
Absolutely.
embodiment.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering, like, oh, I want to hear more.
I have lots of things with dancers here. These are things with dancers where I love doing stuff with dancers, and I find also that it's often people become so, in academia, we all become so siloed in our little worlds that we don't branch out and do enough with other arts, right? I literally have in my inbox right now, this might not load, a text chain started with the dance department at Hunter College. We literally, today I got a bunch of, I started something with my friend Maura. So I think it's extremely important. I would love to see more collaboration. You know, music theory really walled itself off in the history of music theory. And it was, yeah, it's not going to load. But if you're well, yeah, there's something that, you know, that me doing some dancing stuff on the cello there. But, you know, music theory walled itself off the way it did because, well, it wants to kind of enshrine and reinforce its power because music majors generally all need to, they tell all the students that you have to take X number of semesters of music theory. And it ranges from 2 to 6 semesters, generally, to be a music major, right? So we call it a core class. But then it gets enshrined in curricula and in the institutions. And generally speaking, the field of music theory does not want to deal with things outside of music because of its conservative nature. It's extremely conservative generally. Musicology history is slightly less conservative, but still very conservative historically, right? I'm a big fan of doing that, and it's just really hard. If the question is, you know, how can we try to do it, you know, well, I'm trying right now, and it's still in the works, and I hope that I can be successful at Hunter College. I think, for instance, having departments come together. I've thought about maybe we should, in our School of Arts and Sciences, carve out a school of performance where we have dance, theater, and music together. That happens, right? And things change and morph into new things. That could be an answer.
Well, even just looking at your photo there, like when you perform with a musical instrument of any kind, you're doing a dance, right? You're
Absolutely.
moving. It's an act of breathing. It's an act of all kinds of movement and gesture that only happens if you're doing it, which is movement.
Absolutely.
Like that's a dance out there. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
What
Yeah.
about classes in that, like just a somatic practice of instrument and body?
Yeah.
I don't know if that, I mean, that must exist.
You know, I've always wanted to teach like a music and dance class based on some of the things I used to do, and this is years ago. But yeah, I mean, we can talk afterward, and maybe you can give me some of your ideas.
Hilarious.
So one of our grad students who's watching online, a personal question. How do you keep all the problems with Western classical music and the way it's taught from completely undermining your enjoyment of it?
Didn't we talk a little bit about that yesterday? You asked the question, right. Was it Sean? Yeah. Well, maybe I should have Sean answer. Yeah, the first thing to say is, and I did say it, I think 5 or 10 minutes ago, that I really love classical music because there's a lot of great music out there, and I'm a cellist, and cellists play that stuff, right? So if I'm just enjoying the music and playing I'm a 20th century guy as a cellist too, so like a Bartok string quartet. You know, that's just amazing stuff. Arvo Pärt, who's still alive, I think, the Estonian composer. I love his music. And Sofia Gubaidulina, she died a couple of years ago. She wrote very interesting music for cello and orchestra and chambers ensembles and things like that. I mean, I don't really think about it when I'm listening to concerts or playing cello. I don't think about it as, oh, this history is so awful and I can't deal with it. And it's not like I no longer enjoy the things. I mean, it's just, I'll make the language analogy again. I'm speaking English. And by golly, I think I speak it pretty well. and it's like, what, am I going to stop dealing with reading English because of the colonial aspect of English? Well, I don't know. the only other language I could actually read in is Russian. I'm a fluent Russian speaker, honestly. And then I know some other languages, but not fluently. So I think that it's actually not that difficult to continue to love classical music, the stuff that I like. I have tastes, I have musical tastes. One thing that I do stress, and I stressed it before and a half an hour ago, and I'm going to stress it again, is be skeptical. Be skeptical in a classroom, because what we have been taught, sometimes it's kind of on the money, and sometimes it is proselytization, indoctrination of a system that was never fair. Music education in the United States, I'll just keep it to the United States and not impugn Canada, it was never fair. Doesn't mean there wasn't some really cool, badass music, but it was never fair. It really privileged whiteness plus maleness, and without saying it, people who themselves identified as such, and let's just please throw in if you knew some German, and if by golly you were a pianist, well, you're already, and a white man, you're already a music theorist whether you know it or not, right? And that's ridiculous, because any music has a music theory, period. Any music on planet Earth has a music theory, period. And I think I made another point with somebody where the problem with what we're dealing with is that, and it was a simple article switch, that the point I made yesterday somewhere, is we have been taught that it is the music theory and the best music on the world, when it is simply a music theory and a music, classical music. That's it. That's all. No more, no less. It is a music, and that's great. So enjoy it, listen to it if you must, if you will. I shouldn't say if you must. If you must. Listen to Bruckner if you must. That's the right way to put that. No, I love listening to classical music. I don't do it that much. I usually go to rock and stuff because it's actually sometimes hard to hear. In the car, you need to be in a Rolls Royce if you're going to listen to a Mahler symphony. It just doesn't make any sense. You're going to be turning the volume up and down the whole ride. So you listen to some hip hop and rap and whatever, or Sufjan Stevens, one of my favorite artists, right?
Just if you could go over your process for when you wrote the chapter on blues for the textbook, right?
Correct.
When you're choosing what artists to include and what music to include, and I guess what you're trying to do to differentiate that from who's included in the Western classical education.
Thank you for that question. I've never been asked that. It's a good question because if you're going to write a chapter on blues, I believe in representation. And there are a million blues musicians, but the ones everyone knows are black men, right? And of course you can find white men because, you can. Therefore, the way I wrote that chapter is I'm like, I really need to make more representation here. And that's hard because I had to find. So, you can find Bessie Smith or Rosetta Tharpe. Those are kind of easy names, black women, right? But I don't know if you know the artist Adim, the artist, also goes by Adim Maria. He's a non-binary white person from East Tennessee. And he's got a great tune that's he's kind of a country honky-tonk, but blues as well. It's called We Run This Town. I'm like, I was just listening to the artist because I like their music. And I'm like, oh my God, that's the blues. And then a year later, I'm writing the chapter on blues. I'm like, oh yeah, right, there's Adim the artist. Okay, and so I want to find more people to bring them in like that. That's how I approach that. My co-authors have been great too. We have a million conversations about this. And then of course, so you have the artist, you have the repertoire, and then you just go through, the basic aspects of blues. You taught timbre, 12-bar blues, harmonic, syntactical standpoint, and a little bit of history. In a music theory textbook, there's not a lot of time to unfold historical narratives, right? But I was able to have they gave me a couple of paragraphs where I talk about Mississippi Delta and kind of this migration northward from Mississippi, and then you get to Chicago, which is probably the biggest blues city historically. Of course, Kansas City and a handful of others deserve mention as well because it's a very rich tradition that migrated around. But yeah, thanks for the question. It's a good one because it brings up the idea of representation and just being able to see an artist do something, And you're like, oh yeah, for instance, I would never include Eric Clapton because he's a hardcore white supremacist. He just is. And you know, his remake of Bob Marley's I Shot the Sheriff kind of made him, I mean, he was with the Yardbirds and Cream, I think, before, but you know, we avoid people like Eric Clapton at all costs, right? I don't want to give him any oxygen.
Yeah, good idea.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.